Hi, welcome to a new episode of the Japanese Self-Defense Force Unique Airsoft. Today we will go over the Japanese Flakdarn uniform, direct copy of the German Bundeswehr Flakdarn uniform. Well, we will continue to tell you more about the Japanese armed forces. We must go back to the early 1950s. In the 1950s, the Japanese Self-Defense Force was created right after the Korean War. When it became apparent that after the Korean War that there was maybe a chance that North Korea, the Soviet Union or even China could invade Japan without even a big opposition, even the Americans or British occupying mainland Japan at the moment, at that time. So the decision was made by the American government to make the Japanese not only police force units and maintain stability and order in the streets of Tokyo and other parts of Japan, but also making a maritime self-defense force for the Navy, a ground self-defense force for ground forces, and an air self-defense force for the air superiority. But all the weapons, ships and equipment were received by the United States. We will go over then, means tanks, airplanes, ships, rifles, assault weapons, everything that Japanese used in the early stages in the 1950s and 60s were from US import. But the Japanese got all permission from the Japanese government and the US to make their own uniforms and their own weaponry. Though they decided to make a new uniform. What we see is olive green, but they also were lacking more of camouflage, and they were also looking at that, but not so necessarily compared to the Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union or China. So they decided to also do the same point what the Americans did. Olive green uniforms using for older forces and using only camouflage for their helmet. The Japanese self-defense force was using of course, the M1 helmet, one fits all, and the standard weapon was the M1 Garand. But it was not much popular weapon among the Japanese because it was heavy, and was also because of the 30-06 caliber. It was too much of a recoil system, so they preferred to the M2 carbine. It was a low power cartridge, and low power carbine, much shorter, but had a rate of fire of semi-auto else full automatic capacity. And you could carry more rounds of ammunition. Each round of capacity could of 50 rounds capacity to 30 round capacity. So in the mid-60s the Japanese saw that the Americans and Europe, later pronounced as NATO, deciding to use box magazines. The Western Europe goes to what the FAL, FN FAL was developed the Belgians, and the Americans decided to go their own way, of course, going to with the M14. When the Japanese saw the first images from the M14 in real life, they tested it a few times, but even they saw the potential in it. The M14 was recoil full automatic capacity was just not suitable. It could not be controlled on full automatic capacity with a NATO caliber cartridge 7.62. But they still want to have a box magazine weapon, but they not want to import or leasing a license with the M14 or FAL. At that time was the only two choices. After that, the Germans designed their own FAL and came the Gewehr 3, also known as the G3 in Western Europe. Later on, they decided to develop their own weapon, took some inspiration about the G3 and the Russian VT-40 semi-automatic rifle during World War II, and they created the Type 64. Type 64 will continue to serve into late 2020, but will slowly. But it is announced that the Japanese self-defense force has a new weapon, assault rifle, coming up. That will announce in another episode. Back in the early mid-60s, Japanese took really interesting in the uniform, but they took only inspiration about it, and they decided to use their own pattern of use. That was called the Fang pattern. Still using olive green and a camouflage net on their helmets, but they're using also nature to their uniforms. But the Japanese government want to also to see more camouflage use, because the Americans were using more and more about the ARDL variation and tiger stripes, and so the Americans took a lend-lease of their own ARDL pattern to the Japanese. It's called the Fang pattern. As you easily can see, comparisons to the ARDL uniforms that the US was using in the early 80s and mid 90s and early 2000s is almost the same pattern as theirs. But the only difference is it has a different shape, and also it has no black in it compared to the American uniform. This pattern will continue to serve use all the way to the early 2000s, and it was also another pattern used as a normal camouflage. The early 80s, but later on, also at the same time, came also a second pattern. It was more a woodland environment pattern. It was used by the Air Self-Defense Force unit, Ground Self-Defense Force, and later the Air Force Security Forces. But it was not a wide pattern used. Only a few numbers of only security guards and personnel at bases for non-logistic areas was using it. But finally, the Japanese armed forces had seen a uniform that the Japanese armed forces, high command and the government especially wanted. The Germans had developed in the early 80s, early 90s, their own flak tarn variation. Many say it is almost a direct copy of the Germans' Third Reich, to the SS using it during World War II. If you compared it with World War II patterns from the SS, then yes. But in my eyes, this is a good uniform to use and also a good variation for a woodland environment. So the Japanese decided to ask for permission to make their own variation. They got it, they make it their own, and later on two variations of pattern came into service, and it was more a green dominant variation. You can see the two patterns first. But still, this camouflage will continue to serve with the Japanese armed forces. Even with the new branches from the Maritime Self-Defense Force is called the Navy of the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is of course not old, not so very old, it's only a year or two in Japanese service, because the Japanese did not allow to have a Marine Corps at the early stages. The Japanese flak tarn pattern was also called as J-tie in Japanese. So I will still call it flak tarn uniform as easy, but the official word in Japanese is Gentai. The Gentai uniform will continue to see service at the three branches of the Japanese forces: the Ground Self-Defense Force, Air Self-Defense Force, paratroopers especially, and of course the Marine Corps of the Japanese Armed Forces. And their standard weapons at the moment for the assault teams is the Type 89. The Type 89 will be more covered in a separate video, but there are two variations about the Type 89. The folding stock variation and a normal variation. The folding variation is more used for paratroopers units, and a normal stock variation is more in use for combat for underground. Because of those two, but it's easy to manufacture and it's used in gas piston compared to a Colt using a gas system, not compared to each other. The Japanese decided still using the olive green pattern in their armies, but only as training exercises of juist or rearguard rear units. They even have the old pattern uniform still in use today, but because they have not a big budget most of the time, they're still using old equipment and uniform to maintain their armies. Not most efficient if you might think, but if you keep it good running and maintain it very well, they will keep good service in use. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you next time in another pattern going to surface. Then we will go to talk to about another pattern, the so-called the Fang pattern. There's not much information about it from that I can find so far, but I have a few videos coming up for that. So I hope you enjoyed this video and leave a comment section down below. See you next time.